welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Here on the Deep Dive,
Mm.
we take a really fascinating subject,
Yeah.
a whole stack of sources,
Yeah.
and we really try to, boil it down
Right.
to the most essential insights.
Right.
And we do it for you.
Right.
We know that you're the kind of person who really is keen to grasp complex topics,
Yeah.
but you want to do it quickly.
Right.
And thirdly,
Yeah.
someone who appreciates those aha moments
Yeah, absolutely.
without getting bogged down
Absolutely.
in a lot of detail.
I mean, it's not that the details aren't interesting.
Right.
It's that you just want to get to the
Yeah,
heart of the matter.
the bottom line.
Yeah.
So today we're diving deep into the world of August Wilhelm Rehberg, 1757 to 1836.
Right.
A name that you might not recognize immediately.
Uh-huh.
But trust me, this is a thinker who occupies a surprisingly pivotal position
Yeah.
in classical German philosophy.
Exactly. So if you're thinking about the landscape between Kant and Hegel, I mean, you think, oh, that's when all of the action was happening in German philosophy.
Right.
It was just brimming with innovation, and
Yeah.
Rehberg was right there in the thick of it.
Totally.
And yet, his contributions are often overlooked.
Yeah, and it's remarkable, too, because, his credentials alone
Yeah.
should pique any philosopher's interest. We're talking about someone whose reviews of Kant were so insightful that they sparked a correspondence with Kant,
Yeah.
leading Kant himself to clarify crucial aspects of his mathematical doctrines.
Yeah. In fact, Kant's biographer considered Rehberg the finest head among Kant's students.
Oh,
That's a pretty ringing endorsement.
it is.
Yeah.
To be considered, the top
Yeah.
student by Kant's biographer.
Yeah. And think about all of the big names that came out of that milieu.
Right.
The fact that he was considered the finest of them all
Wow.
really says something.
Yeah, and so, we've got these reviews of Kant
Yeah.
that spark this correspondence.
Yeah.
He wades into the famous pantheism
Yeah.
controversy,
Yeah.
offering a unique skeptical voice alongside giants like Jacobi, Mendelssohn, Herder, and Kant.
Right.
This guy was in the thick of it.
It seems like it. Yeah.
And then, perhaps most significantly,
Right.
for the trajectory of post-Kantian thought,
Uh-huh.
his sharp critique of Reinhold's elementar philosophy fueled the growing skepticism surrounding the very possibility of neo-Kantian foundationalism.
Right.
So key insight for you right off the bat. This guy was a huge, huge player.
Exactly. So he's doing all of these things that could each be seen as a really significant contribution
Right.
to the history of philosophy. I mean, any one of them would probably warrant a footnote, at least,
Right.
in a history of philosophy. But the main reason why we're interested in Rehberg is because of his critique of the French Revolution
Okay, so this
in the early 1790s.
so this wasn't just a passing commentary.
Right.
Like, I'm not a fan of this.
Right.
This really cemented his reputation as a leading conservative thinker.
Exactly. I mean, you could even call him a founding father of German conservatism.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this deep dive, tailored specifically
Right.
for your philosophical interest, because we know that's what you're here for,
Exactly.
we're going to unpack Rehberg's core philosophical and political ideas,
Mm-hmm.
paying particular attention to his analysis
Yes.
of the French Revolution.
Absolutely.
Our mission here is to understand his arguments
Right.
and explore why engaging with this historical figure can still offer valuable perspectives
Right.
for philosophical thought today.
Yeah, I think that's really important to kind of get that historical perspective and see how it can inform our contemporary views.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. So, who was this Rehberg?
Yeah.
What intellectual currents shaped his unique perspective?
So it would be easy, I think, to dismiss Rehberg as just a secondary figure. Maybe as someone who's echoing the critique of someone like Gentz,
Okay.
who was a very prominent voice against the revolution.
Okay.
Or maybe even as a kind of a pale German imitation of Burke.
Okay.
But I think that would be selling him short.
Okay.
Because while Gentz was a prominent voice against the revolution,
Right.
Rehberg brings a greater degree of political wisdom and philosophical depth to his analysis.
Okay.
And even though Burke's reflections were certainly influential in Germany,
Okay.
it's interesting to note that Rehberg published his critique of the revolution before Burke did.
Wow.
So in a way, he's got his finger on the pulse of what's happening
Yeah.
before Burke does.
Interesting.
A lot of scholars think that even though Rehberg's work lacked lacks the rhetorical flourishes.
Okay.
It has a more rigorous philosophical engagement with the principles of the revolution.
Interesting.
So he's not interested in just kind of the rhetorical broadsides.
Okay.
He really wants to argue
Right. Yeah.
carefully and systematically.
So he garners attention early on.
Yeah.
I mean, with these contributions.
He does. His articles in the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung, which was like the journal
Oh, wow.
to be published in at the time,
Okay.
dissecting the French Revolution.
Okay.
These made him a major figure.
Okay.
And this is at a time when a lot of German intellectuals were initially very enthusiastic about the revolution.
Oh,
They thought, oh, this is great. This is the realization of the Enlightenment.
Right.
But Rehberg's one of these people that's like, no, I'm not so sure about this.
Right.
And he offers a very clear defense of a more conservative viewpoint.
Okay.
And he really stresses Germany's historical traditions.
Okay.
So this is another key insight.
Hmm.
Even amidst all of this enthusiasm, Rehberg is kind of a voice.
A dissenting voice.
A dissenting voice, yeah.
Yeah.
A voice of caution.
So he wasn't just reacting to the events.
Right.
It seems like his influence is much more lasting.
It is. It's lasting in at least two ways. One, he challenges what he sees as the abstract idealism of the revolutionaries
Okay.
and stresses historical continuity.
Okay.
And by doing that, he becomes a really important figure in the development of historicism,
Okay.
which was this big intellectual movement
Okay.
that stresses the importance of history and tradition,
Okay.
the unique character of nations,
Okay.
understanding law and culture and politics.
Got it.
But then he also had this very close personal and intellectual relationship with Karl von Stein,
Okay.
who was a central figure in the Prussian reform movement.
Got it.
And because of that, Rehberg's ideas had a very direct influence on the political landscape.
Interesting.
So it's not just that he's writing these things.
Right.
He's also in the ears of people
Right.
who are actually making decisions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's always an interesting, thing to think about
Yeah.
too, is the personal circumstances
Yeah.
that shape a philosopher's work.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Rehberg, I'm getting the sense that his academic path wasn't straightforward.
It wasn't. And it's really unfortunate because he was clearly a very gifted guy, but
Okay.
his career wasn't the typical academic one.
Okay.
A professorship in Berlin was reportedly blocked by Frederick the Great himself,
What?
who had this policy of hiring cooks from Hanover
Wow.
instead of professors.
I mean, I'm all about good food, but that seems a little...
Misplaced priorities.
A
Yeah.
little strange.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
So he spent this kind of unfulfilling time tutoring Englishmen in German
Okay.
and eventually ended up in the service of the Duke of York
Okay.
and later within the Hanoverian Geheimer Ratskollegium.
What is that?
It was essentially a secret advisory council.
Okay.
It's kind of ironic that it was largely composed of aristocrats,
Okay.
but most of the work was done by bourgeois secretaries.
So these guys were the worker bees, but they didn't have the power.
Exactly. They didn't have the voting power, right? Right.
So Rehberg is in this position,
Okay.
doing all this work, and doesn't really have a lot of power.
Right.
And this is a big administrative burden.
Yeah.
So it limits the time he can actually dedicate to writing.
Right. So he's not producing,
Yeah,
big philosophical works.
exactly. A lot of his ideas are scattered
Okay.
in various essays and reviews.
I see.
Yeah.
And then there's this fascinating connection to the Romantics,
Right.
which we should definitely unpack.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, because it seems like he didn't agree with them philosophically.
Right. So his father was close friends with Johann Adolf Schlegel,
Okay.
who was the father of August Wilhelm and Friedrich Schlegel,
Okay.
who were these very famous romantics.
Right.
And the families were quite close. Young Rehberg even played with the Schlegel children,
Wow.
and his sister, Caroline, even became Friedrich Schlegel's first love.
Oh, wow.
And he even immortalized her in his novel Lucinde.
But despite these close personal connections,
Yeah.
Rehberg had deep skepticism
Okay.
of what he saw as the Romantics' excessive self-indulgence
Right.
and mystical tendencies.
Okay.
He always kept them at a distance.
Yeah, so intellectually.
Right.
Where did Rehberg's skepticism and foundational philosophical principles originate?
So he was a really precocious guy. He was a
Good.
big reader,
Okay.
mastered several languages.
Wow.
But at Göttingen, he found the dominant philosophical trend, which was popular philosophy.
What is popular philosophy?
So this was kind of a more accessible interpretation
Okay.
of Enlightenment ideas.
Okay.
But Rehberg thought it wasn't very rigorous.
So he wasn't a fan.
Not really. He was more interested in getting into Leibniz and Spinoza.
Okay.
So this early self-directed study
Okay.
was really crucial for fueling his skepticism,
Okay.
which appears very early on.
Okay.
Like 14 years old, he's having doubts about Christian dogma.
Wow.
Yeah. And this leads to a lifelong rejection
Okay.
of religious belief and a general skepticism about metaphysics.
Right.
So he's questioning even Leibniz and Spinoza.
Okay.
He doesn't like that they rely on these first principles.
Oh.
He writes a skeptical essay for the Berlin Academy,
Okay.
but he's kind of pretending to defend Leibniz
Okay.
because the Academy is really influenced by Leibniz. So it's a very strategic move.
Interesting.
But he later confesses that he really thought that Spinoza's system, while impressive, revealed the limitations of metaphysics.
Wow.
So he's got this very critical view of metaphysics.
Okay.
Yeah.
So were there any particular thinkers that really shaped his outlook?
Yeah, absolutely. I think three are really important here.
Okay.
Hume, whose skepticism was very popular
Okay.
in Hanoverian intellectual circles.
Okay.
He was very influential for Rehberg.
Okay.
I think Rehberg learns from Hume how skepticism can be applied to defend conservatism. So he's getting that kind of political use of skepticism from Hume.
Okay.
But then he's also influenced by Justus Moser,
Okay.
who's the Advocatus Patriae of Osnabrück,
Okay.
a really key figure in the development of historicism.
Okay.
And he becomes kind of a mentor to Rehberg.
Okay.
Rehberg meets him while he's working as a bureaucrat
Okay.
in Osnabrück. And Moser instills in him this appreciation for the traditions of the Kleinstadt,
The Kleinstadt.
which are these small German states.
Okay.
And Moser saw them as embodying the principles of German civil society.
Okay.
And he sees them as prior to the revolution.
Okay.
So these are embodying these fundamental
Principles.
of German civil society.
Okay.
But then the third figure, and perhaps the most important, is Kant.
Okay.
So Rehberg is very impressed by Kant's critique of rationalist metaphysics
Okay.
and his account of the limits of human knowledge.
Right.
So he embraces the skepticism. But where he diverges from Kant is on the issue of applying moral philosophy to politics.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Hume's skepticism.
Right.
We've got Moser's emphasis on tradition.
Right.
And then this selective engagement with Kant.
Right.
And it's like all of these things together
Yeah.
shape his unique perspective.
Yeah. You can see these three strands coming together and
Right.
forming his worldview.
Okay, let's move on to his early philosophical engagements, particularly his involvement in the pantheism controversy.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like a crucial period for the development of his thought.
It's really important to see that his philosophical and political ideas
Yeah.
are really interconnected from the beginning.
Okay.
And he says that himself later on,
Okay.
that his general philosophical principles are central to his thought.
Okay.
And the pantheism controversy really sets the intellectual stage for the era.
Okay.
Because it starts in 1785
Right.
with Jacobi's claim that Lessing was a Spinozist. And Jacobi argues that all rational inquiry
Okay.
leads to Spinoza's atheism and determinism.
Okay.
And the only way out of that is a leap of faith into belief in a personal God
Okay.
and human freedom.
Okay.
So this is a huge dilemma
Yeah.
for the German Enlightenment
Right.
because they had all this faith in reason.
Right.
And now Jacobi's saying, well, if you follow reason all the way, it leads to Spinoza and atheism and determinism.
Right.
So what do you do?
Right.
So that's the context.
Right.
And then Rehberg enters this debate with his own perspective.
Right.
So he already had this underlying skepticism.
Okay.
But it's really in response to these issues that he formulates his philosophical framework.
Okay.
So his key contributions are these reviews of Jacobi and Herder in the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung,
Okay.
and his 1787 treatise über das Verhältnis der Metaphysik zu der Religion, on the relationship of metaphysics to religion.
Okay.
So in these writings, his skepticism influenced by Kant really becomes solidified. And he agrees with Kant that pure reason and our senses can't give us knowledge of things in themselves.
Okay.
But he rejects Kant's idea of practical faith
Okay.
as a way to justify religious belief.
So Kant wants to kind of ground religious belief.
Right, in morality.
And morality in.
Right, and in the postulates of practical reason.
Right.
But Rehberg doesn't buy it.
Okay.
He thinks if religion has any justification, it's political.
Okay.
Like it's useful for keeping people in line.
Got it.
But for him, an educated person doesn't need that.
Okay.
They can live a stoic life based on duty,
Okay.
irrespective of their happiness.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems that at a time when lots of thinkers wanted to affirm some sort of religious belief,
Right.
Rehberg stood out
Yeah.
with this consistent skepticism.
Exactly. And that was his unique contribution.
Okay.
So he agrees with Jacobi that metaphysics culminates in Spinozism,
Okay.
but he doesn't think that proves pantheism
Okay.
or that we should take a leap of faith. He dismisses all of metaphysics as empty speculation.
Wow.
And he thinks it can't give us a rational justification for a personal God.
So he really just does away with metaphysics.
Yeah, he's very suspicious of it. He thinks that even if you could prove a first cause,
Okay.
you couldn't prove that it has understanding and will.
Okay.
He thinks we just project those things
Okay.
because we have them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
His friend J.J. Engel asked him if he wants to reduce religion to poetry.
Right.
And what did he say?
He pretty much agrees.
He does.
He does.
Okay.
But he adds the qualification that poetry can sometimes have moral value.
Okay.
So it's not completely useless.
Right.
But he doesn't see it as a source of truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this skepticism already had implications for his early political views even before the revolution.
Yeah. So even in Über das Verhältnis,
Yeah.
which is published just before the revolution,
Okay.
you can see these seeds
Yeah.
of his conservative thought. So he says relying only on abstract reason as the basis for running a state is dangerous
Okay.
because it leads to unrealistic expectations.
Okay.
He says the practical realities of state administration
Yeah.
often require you to make decisions
Yeah.
that can't be derived from pure reason.
Right.
And he thinks even in a perfect rational system, you'd sometimes have to use force
Right.
to resolve conflicts and maintain order.
Yeah, because people aren't always rational.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's a firm believer in elite rule.
Okay.
He thinks that governing well requires specialized knowledge
Okay.
that not everyone has.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because we're coming out of the pantheism controversy where it's like, okay,
Right.
these big metaphysical systems maybe aren't where it's at.
Right.
And then we move to Reinhold's elementar philosophy.
Right.
And I guess, for those who might not be familiar,
Yeah.
what was Reinhold trying to do?
So this is the early 1790s.
Okay.
And Reinhold is trying to create a really radical foundationalist basis for Kant's philosophy.
Okay.
So he wants to derive all of Kant's conclusions from a single self-evident first principle.
Wow.
So he wants to ground the whole thing
Yeah.
on one unassailable principle.
So this is a big project.
It's huge, and it sparks all these debates
Okay.
about whether foundationalism is even possible.
Right.
So this is a big question. Can all of our knowledge be based on a single principle?
Right.
And Rehberg, being a skeptic,
Right.
is very suspicious
Right.
of this kind of grand philosophical system building.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's his assessment of this project?
Yeah, so in his reviews for the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung,
Yeah.
especially the January 1791 review,
Okay.
he really goes after Reinhold.
Okay.
He basically says, look, you're ignoring Kant's own warnings about the limits of human knowledge.
Okay.
He thinks Reinhold should have just popularized Kant
Okay.
instead of trying to create a new system. Yeah, and one of the things he points out is that Reinhold starts with definitions.
Okay.
And Kant says definitions should be the end of inquiry,
Right. Not the beginning.
not
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yeah.
And he also criticizes Reinhold for neglecting the difference between math and philosophy.
Okay.
He says that math can construct its objects
Okay.
through intuition,
Okay.
but philosophy can't.
So philosophy is stuck with concepts.
Right.
Okay.
And that means that the meaning of a philosophical definition
Yeah.
depends on our interpretation.
Okay.
So there's no guarantee of agreement.
Okay. So there's this, sort of fundamental difference in method
Right.
between math and philosophy.
Right.
Okay.
And this is going to have implications for how we think about knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So he makes this really interesting point about definitions and criteria,
Yeah.
which seems to have implications beyond just Reinhold's work.
It does. His main point is that a definition need not contain a criterion of that which falls under it. So what does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean?
He's saying that just because you have a definition of something
Okay.
doesn't mean you know how to apply it.
Okay.
in every case.
Right.
So to apply a general principle,
Okay.
you need a criterion to identify the specific cases where it applies.
Okay.
But sometimes those criteria don't exist
Okay.
because applying a principle is an act of judgment.
Okay.
And judgment, according to Kant,
Yeah.
doesn't rely on predefined rules.
Right. So it's this separate faculty.
It is. It's its own thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's not making this point just for the sake of it.
No, he's got a political motivation here.
Okay.
He's targeting philosophers who think their first principles are guidelines for society.
Okay.
He thinks that's a really bad idea.
So, like, get your philosophical principles out of my politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
He thinks that's a recipe for disaster.
So these reviews, they have an impact.
They do. They're very influential.
Oh,
People read them. They take them seriously.
Okay.
And they even contribute to Reinhold having a bit of a breakdown.
Right.
So they're not just abstract academic exercises.
Right.
They have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
And more broadly, Rehberg's work is part of this growing skepticism about foundationalism,
Okay.
which becomes really important
Right.
for the development of Romanticism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we take a step back,
Yeah.
what are the big themes of his skepticism?
So I think two are really important. The
Right.
first is this Kantian idea that we can't know things in themselves.
Okay.
We can only know appearances.
Okay.
But the second one is this insistence on a gap between the universal and the particular,
Okay.
even in the realm of appearances.
Okay.
So he's saying that our concepts
Okay.
can never fully capture
Okay.
the richness of specific instances.
Okay.
And this is going to be really important
Oh.
for this political philosophy.
Okay.
Because he's going to say, you can't just take these universal principles of reason
Okay.
and apply them directly to politics.
All right.
You need something else. You need judgment.
Okay, so we see this skeptical epistemology
Right,
really focused on the limits of abstract reason.
right.
So how does this then translate into his political convictions?
Yeah, so his political convictions develop early in his career,
Okay.
like well before the revolution.
Okay.
And he, like a lot of intellectuals in Hanover, is a huge admirer of the British Constitution.
Okay.
And this isn't just because of the dynastic ties between Britain and Hanover.
Okay.
It's also because of thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Delhomme,
Cool.
who thought that the British system was great.
All right.
They thought it was this perfect blend
Okay.
of modern freedoms with ancient institutions.
Okay.
So you've got the monarchy, the aristocracy, parliament,
Okay.
but you've also got toleration, freedom of speech,
Okay.
opportunities for commoners to participate in government.
So this seems like a really good balance.
Yeah, a lot of people thought so.
Okay, so what did they find so appealing about the British system?
Well, from the Hanoverian perspective,
Yeah.
the great strength of the British system is that it protects against radical democracy and absolutism.
Okay.
So they thought the limited franchise
Okay.
kept things from descending into mob rule,
Okay.
but at the same time, Parliament kept the monarch in check.
So a balance of power.
Exactly. And they were really impressed by the party system,
Okay.
which they saw as a way to organize politicians
Okay.
and create accountability.
Okay.
So that's what they liked about it.
So given this admiration for the British model,